The chalk squeaked against the blackboard as Professor Amelia Rhodess drew the final symbol of the equation, and then she stepped back and let the silence do its work. The evening lecture hall at Northwestern University held 43 students, all of them staring at what she had written across the 3 full panels with the careful attention of people who sensed they were looking at something designed to defeat them. The equation was a masterpiece of mathematical cruelty. It combined elements from topology, number theory, and quantum mechanics in a configuration that had no business working as a single unified problem. She had constructed it herself over the course of 3 weeks, assembling it the way a craftsman builds a trap, with patience and precision and a clear understanding of exactly what kind of prey she wanted it to catch. She brushed chalk dust from her hands with a satisfied motion and surveyed the room. "Anyone who can solve this equation," she announced, allowing a small laugh to color her voice, "I'll marry them on the spot." A few students chuckled with the nervous energy of people who aren't quite sure if their professor is joking. Near the door, a janitor had paused his mopping. He was maybe 30 years old, lean, wearing a gray uniform with the Northwestern Facilities logo on the chest, and he was staring at the blackboard with the kind of focus that didn't belong to someone who happened to be waiting for a lecture to end. He whispered something. Amelia turned sharply. "What did you say?" His hands tightened on the mop handle. "I think I can solve it." The room went very still. Amelia Rhodess had been constructed for greatness, the way a building is constructed for a specific purpose. Her father, Dr. Marcus Rhodess, was a theoretical physicist at MIT, whose name appeared in 4 major quantum mechanics textbooks used in universities across the world. Her mother, Dr. Sarah Chen Rhodess, had resolved 3 of the 7 Millennium Prize problems before retiring to raise Amelia in their Cambridge mansion, where retirement meant shifting her attention from professional publication to the focused cultivation of a daughter she intended to be exceptional. Exceptional meant something particular in that household. Where other children had bedtime stories, Amelia had mathematical proofs. Where other children had birthday parties with neighborhood kids, Amelia had dinner tables populated by Nobel laureates and Fields Medal winners who discussed her potential across the salad course, as though she were a promising experiment rather than a child eating beside them. She attended university lectures by 12. She published her first peer-reviewed paper at 16. Her doctorate from Harvard at 23 was not a milestone but a delivery on a promise that had been made before she was old enough to understand it was being made. Northwestern offered her a tenured position at 28, which made her the youngest tenure-track professor in the university's history. Now at 30, she moved through the mathematics department with the unquestioned authority of someone who had never needed to earn standing because she had arrived with it already established. Her office displayed framed degrees, photographs with famous mathematicians, awards from organizations most people had never heard of. There was not a single personal item in the room that didn't relate to her professional identity. She had never noticed this. She developed a habit of not making eye contact with service workers. She had not noticed this either. Ethan Ward's life had traveled a different trajectory entirely. His mother, Linda, was a high school English teacher who had noticed her son arranging building blocks into complex geometric patterns before he was 4 years old. By 6, he was solving algebraic equations. By 10, he was attending community college calculus courses in the evenings, sitting among adults twice his age with a spiral notebook and a careful, serious attention that made the instructors feel vaguely unsettled. Yale's program for exceptionally gifted students accepted him at 16. And Linda Ward had cried for an hour in the school parking lot because all the years of early mornings and second jobs and saying no to things she couldn't afford had turned into this, and it felt like the story was supposed to go well from here. At Yale, Ethan had found his place in the way that people who have spent their whole lives slightly out of step find it when the right door finally opens. His work on nonlinear differential equations attracted international attention by his second year. At 19, he became the youngest recipient of the Fields Medal, the highest honor in mathematics, and tech companies flew him to meetings in glass offices and offered him numbers with many zeros, while universities competed for his attention with promises of resources and freedom and institutional prestige. The future spread before him like a proof with only elegant solutions. Then the phone rang. His mother had collapsed during class. The diagnosis arrived 3 days later in a specialist's office where a doctor used careful language to describe a rare cancer attacking her nervous system. Treatment existed, experimental but promising, at a specialized facility in Switzerland. The cost was $200,000 to begin. There was no insurance coverage for experimental procedures. There was no family money. There was no path to the treatment that didn't require Ethan to become the path himself. He withdrew from Yale overnight. He liquidated everything he owned. He took out loans. He worked 3 jobs simultaneously, sleeping 3 hours a night, and he watched his mother fade regardless. The treatment bought time, but not enough of it. Linda Ward died 6 months after the diagnosis in a state hospital, holding Ethan's hand and apologizing through morphine-dulled consciousness for ruining his life. She was apologizing for getting sick. She was apologizing for needing him. He held her hand and told her she hadn't ruined anything, and those were the last words he said to her, and he had meant them completely. The grief that followed didn't arrive gradually. It arrived all at once, like a structure collapsing rather than a structure eroding. Ethan burned his research papers in the hospital parking lot on a cold November evening. He deleted every academic contact from his phone. He threw his Fields medal into a dumpster behind a convenience store and watched the lid fall closed over it without feeling anything in particular. The prodigy ceased to exist. In his place stood a hollow man who took whatever work he could find and asked nothing of the future. 5 years later, he pushed a mop through the mathematics building at Northwestern University, the same institution that had once offered him their most prestigious research fellowship, and every evening after the last students left, he would stand before the equations on the blackboards and solve them silently before erasing them with his cleaning cloth. He told himself it was just a habit. He told himself it was just the part of him that couldn't quite let go all the way. He didn't examine it more closely than that. 3 days after the equation appeared on Amelia's blackboard, the confrontation continued in ways neither of them had quite planned. Ethan had been mentally working the problem during every quiet moment of his shift. In the supply closet between tasks, in the break room during the 15 minutes he was officially allowed to stop. The approach the problem demanded was unconventional. It required a synthesis of methods from papers published in the past year, which meant current journals, which meant he had been in the university library after hours using his facility's key card for purposes that had nothing to do with facilities. He worked at a table in the far corner away from security cameras, spreading his calculations across pages torn from a composition notebook. The familiar rhythm returned the way a language returns to someone who grew up speaking it and then spent years in a country where no one understood it. Slowly, at first, and then with increasing fluency, and then with a speed and confidence that felt like remembering rather than learning. His mother's voice kept surfacing in his memory. Not her voice at the end, not the morphine-moot sounds of her last weeks, but her real voice. The voice from the mathematics competition when he was 12 years old, and she had stood at the edge of the crowd and watched him receive his first trophy, and afterward put her hand on his shoulder and told him that he had a gift and that he shouldn't let anyone make him feel ashamed of it. He had carried those words for 18 years. He had also spent the last 5 of those years testing whether he could survive without them. By Thursday of that week, Amelia had discovered that someone was using the blackboard in the abandoned seminar room. The work she found there stopped her in the doorway for a full minute before she entered, crossed to it, and began reading with the focused attention she reserved for things that surprised her. The approach was elegant. Genuinely elegant, not in the way that competent mathematics is elegant, but in the way that mathematics is elegant when someone sees the underlying structure of a problem rather than just its surface. The handwriting was neat but slightly unpracticed, as if the person had been away from blackboards for a while and was relearning the physical vocabulary alongside the mathematical one. She photographed everything before erasing it, then spent the rest of the day trying to understand the methodology. It used techniques from papers she had read in the past 6 months. No amateur would know these papers. No amateur would know what to do with them. That evening she waited outside the seminar room in the dark. At midnight, Ethan appeared. He went directly to the blackboard and continued where the previous work had ended, and she watched through the door's narrow window as he worked through transformations she had only seen attempted in the most advanced journals. His movements were confident now in a way they had not been during that first exchange in her lecture hall. He moved like someone who had stopped pretending to be someone else. When he sensed her presence and turned, she was already gone, walking quickly down the empty hallway with something she couldn't immediately identify happening in her chest. She sat in her office in the dark for a long time afterward. The world had a natural order that she had been taught to believe in and enforce, and she was sitting in the dark wondering if she had been wrong about it. The video appeared on the university's social media channels on Friday afternoon. A graduate student named Jennifer Wu had been practicing a presentation in an empty classroom when Ethan entered to clean, and she had asked him, partly as a joke and partly out of the curiosity that had been building since the rumors started, if he could solve the differential equation still written on the board from an earlier class, a graduate-level problem that had been giving several PhD candidates significant difficulty. Jennifer had her phone recording before she finished asking. Ethan studied the board for 30 seconds, his eyes moving in patterns that suggested genuine analysis. Then he picked up chalk and began. He worked through the problem in under 3 minutes, explaining each step in a clear, patient voice that revealed not just mathematical knowledge, but the ability to teach mathematics, which is an entirely different and considerably rarer skill. The video was viewed 1 million times before dinner. The dean's office called an emergency faculty meeting for Saturday morning. The conference room filled with professors from mathematics, physics, and engineering departments, all of whom had already seen the footage. They played it on the projection screen and paused at intervals to examine the work. Senior Professor David Harrison, who had been teaching at Northwestern for 40 years, identified the methodology as material from a paper published in the Journal of Advanced Mathematics the previous year. Not amateur material. Not even graduate student material. The dean turned to Amelia. Her face had been carefully composed throughout the meeting, but her hands were still in her lap in the particular way of someone who is concentrating on keeping them still. Professor Rhodess, you issued this challenge publicly. Can this man actually solve your equation? She had to admit she didn't know. She had to admit the work she had seen him do suggested he might. Monday morning, the dean decided. Main lecture hall. Public demonstration. If he can do what he claims, we need to know who this man really is. Monday arrived gray and drizzling. The largest lecture hall on campus, with a capacity of 500, was packed beyond its comfortable limit. Faculty members from multiple departments filled the front rows. Graduate students stood along the walls. Local news cameras were set up in the back. The university's public relations team stood near the entrance looking collectively uncertain about whether they were about to document a triumph or a disaster. The blackboard had been prepared with the equation exactly as Amelia had written it a week before, covering 3 full panels with its complex and deliberate architecture. Amelia stood at the podium in her best navy suit, which usually made her feel armored, but which this morning felt inadequate in a way she couldn't quite locate. At exactly 10 o'clock, Ethan Ward walked in wearing his janitor's uniform. The room erupted in whispered conversation. Phones emerged. He looked smaller under these slide lights than the figure who had been working through impossible mathematics in the abandoned seminar room at midnight, more exposed. His hands shook slightly as he approached the board, and she noticed that he had tried to clean the permanent stains from under his fingernails. The effort of it, that careful and imperfect self-preparation, moved something in her that she didn't have a name for yet. She made herself speak. Her voice was steady. Mr. Ward, you claimed you could solve this equation. The terms remain the same. He picked up the chalk. For a moment he stood still with 500 people watching his back, and she found herself holding her breath without deciding to. Then his mother's voice arrived in his memory, the warm hand on his shoulder, the pride in her eyes. He began to write. The room fell silent except for chalk on board. His approach was unconventional from the first transformation, and several professors in the front rows leaned forward simultaneously. He worked methodically, and then with increasing speed and confidence, filling board after board, the mathematics building toward its conclusion, with the inevitability of something that was always going to be true and simply needed someone to reveal it. 40 minutes passed. Then an hour. Nobody moved. Professors had pulled out notebooks. Several were following along and occasionally nodding with the restrained excitement of people who are watching something rare happen in real time. When he finally set down the chalk and stepped back, the complete solution covered 5 blackboards. The silence stretched for 10 full seconds before Professor Harrison stood. "My God," he said, his voice carrying across the hall. "It's not just correct, it's beautiful. This is publishable work." The eruption that followed was thunderous. Students stood on chairs. Professors pushed toward the front. But Ethan was looking at Amelia, who stood at the podium with her face gone pale and her carefully constructed certainty about the world's natural order collapsing around her in a way that 500 witnesses were watching happen in real time. He raised his hand for quiet, and the crowd settled. When he spoke, his voice was steady and carried the specific authority of truth. "Professor Rhodess, I don't expect you to honor a promise made in mockery. I didn't solve this for that." He paused. "I solved it because for 5 years I've been invisible in these halls. I've mopped these floors and emptied these waste bins and been looked through as though I were made of glass. Not just by you, but by almost everyone. I solved it because I wanted just once to be seen for who I actually am." The hall was completely still. "All I've ever wanted from anyone here, from you especially, was basic human respect. The kind you extend to another person simply because they're a person." Someone at the back began to clap slowly. Others joined. But Ethan wasn't finished. "My name is Ethan Ward. 5 years ago I was the youngest recipient of the Fields Medal for my work on nonlinear differential equations. I left mathematics to care for my dying mother. After she died, I couldn't find my way back. I've been hiding here in plain sight because being invisible hurt less than remembering who I used to be. The shock that moved through the room was tangible." Professors pulled out phones, searching his name, finding archived articles and photographs, and the record of a mathematical prodigy who had simply disappeared one November. "Solving this equation reminded me that hiding from pain doesn't heal it. It just distributes the damage in different directions." He looked directly at Amelia. "Professor Rhodess, your work in topology is genuinely groundbreaking. You're brilliant, but brilliance without humanity is just cold light. It illuminates nothing that matters." He turned and walked toward the door, leaving behind 5 boards of perfect mathematics and a room full of people reconsidering things they had believed without examination. At the exit, he paused. "The equation has a second solution, by the way, even more elegant than the first. Perhaps Professor Rhodess would like to find it." Then he was gone. And Amelia Rhodess stood at the podium with tears moving down her face in front of 500 witnesses to his grace, and she made no effort to stop them. That evening, she did something she had never done in 3 years at Northwestern. She went to the basement. The custodial break room was small and functional, smelling of industrial cleaner and the particular resignation of spaces that exist to serve rather than to be appreciated. Ethan was in the supply closet organizing bottles of floor wax when she appeared in the doorway, her heels incongruous on the concrete floor, her navy suit completely out of place in the context of mop handles and cleaning supplies. "We need to talk," she said. He didn't turn around. "There's nothing to talk about." "You don't owe me anything, Professor Rhodess." She stepped inside and closed the door behind her. For the next hour she talked about her childhood in that Cambridge mansion. The pressure of being the only child of 2 genius parents, the fear of ever being seen as inadequate, the dinner parties where her potential was discussed over food she barely tasted because she was too busy calculating what the guests thought of her. She talked about relationships that had ended because she couldn't stop competing long enough to be present. In them, she talked about the habit she had built of not looking at service workers because looking at them would require acknowledging them, and acknowledging them felt somehow dangerous to an identity she had spent 3 decades reinforcing. She heard herself saying these things and understood that she had never said them to anyone before. Ethan listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding as though her words confirmed something he had already guessed. When she finished, he turned to face her. "I looked you up," he said quietly, After that first night, your papers, your research. You're brilliant, Professor Rhodess. But brilliance without humanity is just cold light. She felt the tears come then, hot and unstoppable, years of pressure releasing through a crack she hadn't known existed. So he told her everything. Yale at 16, and the Fields Medal at 19, and his mother's diagnosis, and the impossible arithmetic of trying to save someone's life when the numbers simply didn't add up, no matter how you arranged them. He told her about the 3 jobs and the 3 hours of sleep, and watching his mother fade despite everything. He told her about Linda Ward, high school English teacher who had never earned more than $40,000 a year, and had given every dollar she had to give him the chance to become what he became. When she needed treatment, the hospital administrator didn't care about my medal, he said. When I couldn't pay, she died apologizing to me. She was dying, and she was worried about my career. Amelia found herself sitting on an overturned bucket in a supply closet with a $1,000 suit and no composure left, seeing him clearly for the first time. You gave up everything for her, she said, and I wouldn't change it, he replied. Love isn't about what you achieve. It's about what you sacrifice. My mother taught me that. I just wish I'd learned it sooner. She stood to leave, then stopped at the door. The university is going to offer you a position. Pure research your terms. He shook his head. I'm not ready for that life again. She studied him for a moment. What if you didn't have to do it alone? The question surprised them both. She left before he could answer, but the door didn't close completely between them, and they both felt it. Over the following 3 weeks, Amelia returned again and again, drawn by something she had stopped trying to name. She brought journals. They discussed advances in quantum computing and new mathematical frameworks for understanding artificial intelligence, and then they talked about other things, and the walls came down gradually in the way that walls built over decades come down, not all at once but steadily, one stone at a time. She learned about his love of jazz, particularly the mathematical approach to improvisation she heard in Coltrane's recordings. He heard in those improvised runs the same structure she saw in formal proofs, a framework that constrained without suffocating, a set of rules that made genuine freedom possible. She discovered he could repair almost anything mechanical, a skill acquired from necessity during the years when a broken appliance meant the choice between repair costs and groceries. He showed her how he saw patterns everywhere. In the way people moved through the building at different hours, in the rhythm of rain against the tall windows of the mathematics wing, in the way light changed the look of the courtyard across the seasons he had watched from his cleaning cart. He learned about her imposter syndrome, which sat like an uninvited passenger in every room she entered, regardless of how many credentials she had accumulated, about the loneliness of always being the most decorated person present and still feeling like the one most likely to be exposed, about the way she had spent so many years performing certainty that she had lost the ability to distinguish the performance from the reality. Sometimes I feel like I'm performing myself, she said one evening, in the abandoned seminar room where they had begun meeting for reasons that had gradually shifted from professional to something neither of them had named yet. Like the real person disappeared somewhere in graduate school, and all that's left is this character I've been playing ever since. The brilliant, cold professor who needs no one. Ethan had listened to this with an expression she had come to recognize as the one that meant he understood something she hadn't finished saying. I know that feeling, he said. From the other direction, I played the invisible man so long I started to believe that was actually all I was. They began working on a new proof together in the abandoned seminar room, meeting after the building emptied, their work spreading across the blackboards in a collaboration that felt natural and inevitable. Her approach was methodical and rigorous, where his was intuitive and sudden. She built formal structures. He showed her the elegant shortcuts hidden inside them. She gave his insights the architecture they needed to stand up to scrutiny. He showed her places where she had been using 10 steps when 3 would do. The university's research community began to notice that the lights in the seminar room stayed on very late, and that the blackboards were full of work that didn't belong to any current graduate project. The rumors about what was happening in there were considerably less accurate than the reality, which was simply 2 people who thought better together than either had ever thought alone. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday evening in early December, 6 weeks into their collaboration. They had been circling the final transformation for 4 days, both sensing it was close, neither quite seeing the path through. Then suddenly the structure revealed itself with the finality of something that had always been true and simply needed to be recognized. Ethan wrote the last line with a flourish and stepped back, and they stood together looking at what they had made. It was beautiful the way only mathematics can be beautiful, elegant, inevitable, and completely true. The proof would revolutionize an entire subfield of topology and open new avenues of research that would keep mathematicians occupied for decades. It was the kind of result that made the field better for existing. "We did it," Amelia breathed. "We did this together," she said firmly. "Neither of us could have done it alone. That's the point. That's exactly the point." She reached out and took his hand. He didn't pull away. His fingers intertwined with hers, and they stood in the quiet room with the blackboards full around them. "One condition," he finally said. "We publish this paper together, equal authors, no senior, no junior, equals." She felt tears rise, which continued to surprise her. "I wouldn't have it any other way." He smiled, and the expression transformed his face into something younger and open. "There's something else. That equation you gave me, it has a second solution. I found it on the 3rd night." She stared at him. "You mean you could have? I wanted to solve it the hard way first, to prove to myself I still could." He looked at her directly, "But also I wanted more time, more reasons to come back, to talk to you, to watch you think. You're beautiful when you're thinking. You get this small line between your eyebrows and your whole face changes when you see the solution." She was crying, which was not something she did in front of people. "Ethan Ward," she said, "are you telling me you deliberately made this take longer because you were falling in love with me?" "Yes," he said simply. "From that first night when you challenged me with such confident cruelty, I saw through it to the fear underneath. I recognized it because I've been doing the same thing from the opposite direction." He raised their joined hands and pressed his lips to her fingers. "We're quite a pair, the professor who's afraid to be human, and the human who's afraid to be a professor." The International Mathematics Conference in Chicago the following month brought 800 of the world's leading mathematical minds to the grand ballroom of the Palmer House Hilton. The setting was deliberately imposing, all marble floors and crystal chandeliers, and the particular hush of a room full of people who have trained themselves to be impressive. Amelia and Ethan stood at the podium together, and Amelia was aware, for the first time in her professional memory, that she was not performing. She was simply here, with someone beside her doing what they had done together in that quiet seminar room, and that was enough. They took turns explaining sections of the proof, their presentation styles naturally complementary in the way of two instruments that had been composed for the same piece of music. Where Ethan provided intuitive leaps, Amelia offered rigorous justification. Where she constructed formal frameworks, he revealed elegant structures hidden within them. He spoke to the beauty of the mathematics with the direct, unpretentious language of someone who had fallen in love with it honestly, without needing to perform sophistication. She spoke to its rigor with the precision of someone who had trained her whole life to make sure truth could be verified and not just felt. Together, they were considerably more persuasive than either had been alone. And the audience, which contained some of the most critical minds in the world, was not a forgiving one. When they finished, the sustained applause lasted for nearly 2 minutes, which in this room and from this audience was the equivalent of a standing ovation anywhere else. During questions, a professor from Stanford asked about their unusual collaboration. How had two people from such different worlds found common ground? Amelia took the microphone first. She stood for a moment in the way of someone who is about to say something true in front of 800 people, and is just making sure she means it before she does. "I learned that brilliance comes in many forms and from unexpected places. My own assumptions and my own arrogance nearly cost me the opportunity to work with one of the finest mathematical minds of our generation. More than that, they nearly cost me the chance to know an extraordinary human being. I had become very good at looking through people, and looking through people is an excellent way to miss everything that matters." Ethan added, "And I learned that hiding from the world doesn't protect you from pain. It just guarantees you'll face it alone." Professor Rhodess didn't just collaborate with me on this proof. She helped me find my way back to myself. She did it by being willing to change, which turns out to be the hardest thing a person can do. The question period that followed was long and technically demanding and occasionally contentious, because that was the nature of this audience, and Amelia and Ethan answered together or separately, depending on which of them could see the shape of what was being asked. There was an ease to it that neither of them had felt before in this context. Mathematics was supposed to be competitive, a hierarchy of recognition and precedence. What they had built together in that seminar room felt like something else entirely. Afterward, they stood in the conference center lobby as the Chicago skyline darkened and snow began to fall outside, dusting the city in white. Ethan watched the snow through the tall windows and said, with the faint understatement that was one of his best qualities, "That wasn't so bad."
"You were wonderful,"
Amelia said. He turned to her fully, taking both her hands in his. "Amelia, that night a year ago when you said you'd marry whoever solved that equation, it was a cruel joke made from insecurity. I know that. But somewhere along the way, working with you, learning who you actually are, beneath the armor you wear, I started wondering what it would mean if it wasn't a joke. I was horrible to you," she said. "You were a person shaped by your environment, but you changed. You saw me when I'd forgotten how to see myself." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a simple silver ring with a small diamond. "Amelia Rhodess, I've solved your equation. Both solutions, actually. Will you marry me? Not because of a challenge or a joke, but because you've become the constant in every equation of my life." She laughed, warm and full of genuine joy. "Yes," she said, pulling him to his feet. "Yes, but I have a condition. You have to teach me the second solution. We're equals. Remember?" The hall erupted in cheers that carried across the building. 6 months later, the university held a formal ceremony welcoming Dr. Ethan Ward to the faculty. He had accepted the research position with one unusual stipulation that the dean had initially found bewildering and had eventually come to understand. He would continue his facilities duties for 1 hour each day. He was not negotiable on this point. "It keeps me grounded," he explained, calmly, in the dean's office, with Amelia sitting beside him. "It reminds me that every person in this building deserves respect regardless of their job title. And it reminds me of everything that the person I used to be forgot when he was too busy being impressive." The dean, who had been leading the university for 15 years and had seen many things, looked at this unusual man for a long moment and then said that he thought he understood and that the university would accommodate the request. What he did not say, though he thought it, was that the willingness to remain grounded in that particular way spoke better of Ethan Ward's character than any publication record could. The announcement of the new institutional policies came at the same press conference. All support staff at Northwestern would be treated with greater dignity, better wages, brought into alignment with comparable universities, educational opportunities, including tuition assistance for employees who wanted to pursue degrees, a formal staff council with a voice in decisions affecting their working conditions. The language of the announcement credited the inspiration to a faculty member who had requested it as a condition of his appointment, which was true, and which caused the story to be picked up by newspapers that would not normally cover university administrative policy. The ceremony itself was held in the same lecture hall where everything had changed. Ethan stood at the podium in academic robes, which he wore with the slightly uncertain air of someone trying on clothes that fit perfectly, but are not yet familiar. Amelia stood beside him, and the audience included not just faculty and students, but the entire custodial staff, sitting in the front row at Ethan's specific and firm request. Several of them wore their best clothes. One of the older men, who had been mopping these floors for 22 years, was sitting very straight and looking at the podium with an expression that suggested he was feeling the weight of being acknowledged in this particular room. Ethan's acceptance speech was brief, and he meant every word of it. "A year ago I stood in this room and solved an equation, but the real problem that needed solving wasn't mathematical. It was human. It was about how we see each other and how we miss the extraordinary hidden inside the ordinary because we're too busy looking up or looking down instead of straight ahead." He found Amelia in the crowd and held her gaze for a moment. Professor Rhodess challenged me with an impossible equation, but she gave me something more valuable than any mathematical proof. She gave me the courage to be myself again. And then she gave me something even more precious than that. He paused, and the room was so quiet you could hear the ventilation. The knowledge that being myself was enough. The applause was sustained and genuine, and filled the hall in a way that made several people in the audience blink more than necessary. Outside, spring had come to the campus at last. The courtyard trees were beginning to bloom in the tentative way of things that have survived a long, cold season and aren't quite sure yet whether it's safe to open. Two people walked beneath them hand in hand, moving toward a future that, like the best mathematical proofs, was elegant in its simplicity and infinite in its possibilities. The janitor who had become a professor. The professor who had learned to be human. They had solved, between them, the most important problem of all.